Okay, good evening and welcome back from your break. As Don said, I'm Michael Bolden, one of the managing directors of the JSK Journalism Fellowships. We're discussing how to hold the powerful accountable. Don, Marina, and Cecile took us deep into some of the sweeping investigations that journalists do, but now we're going to talk about some of the work that journalists do day in and day out in Washington and elsewhere to help hold your government officials accountable. I'll give you some short background on our speakers, but check Canvas, the online class platform, for more information on our guests. Tonight, to my right, we have Sally Buzbee. She's the executive editor of the Associated Press. It is the not-for-profit news gathering cooperative that is more than 170 years old. Sally worked at various locations for the AP for 30 years, including as Washington bureau chief, where she oversaw coverage of the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. Now she is in charge of all of that, plus AP's coverage of the rest of the world. To my left is Daniel Dale. Daniel is Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star, Canada's largest daily newspaper. You may remember Toronto's crack cocaine smoking mayor Rob Ford from several years ago. Daniel was the reporter in the thick of covering Ford and the fallout. Now he reports from Washington, where he covers Trump and US politics. He is also the journalist behind Daniel Dale's Trump Checks, which tracks false claims made by the president. So, okay, let's go to Washington. One of the things that Sally said actually right before we got on the stage was Daniel and Sally were talking about how they've actually had a little respite this week because the news hasn't been moving at hyper speed. But we exist in an age where it seems the news is always running flat out. Stories that in the past might have received more play and existed longer in the public consciousness, they're there and gone because the next thing's coming down the pike. So Sally, with so much coming at you, how does the AP determine what gets covered and how you're going to deploy limited reporters and editors most effectively?
Yeah, I mean, that's become a real challenge. Obviously, the amount of news that the president and the White House throw off on any given day is quite extraordinary at this moment. And it's not irrelevant, it's not frivolous. I mean, it shakes the world. People in Asia pay attention to what is happening. If you're doing things like making trade decisions that are genuinely globally significant. So obviously we pay a lot of attention to that. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we sort of keep that perspective about what is truly important and what is not as important. And one of the things that we have, or I'm not saying it's not important, it's just not as important, right? And we have tried to keep that perspective and really focus on the serious things that are happening and maybe not quite as much some of the things that are more stylistic and are surprising, but perhaps not quite as significant. It's hard. I mean, we haven't changed anything about our basic standards or the basic way that we approach news. But there have been little things like we didn't used to have a president who would make news at 5:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, right? And so you have to change your shifts. You have to have journalists come in earlier. He walks out of the White House and he sometimes addresses the cameras at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you've got to get your cameras there at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was sort of new, right? We have tried to also make sure, I mean, one of the things, as Michael says, with this incredibly fast-moving news cycle, there can be very significant things that happen and people sort of forget about them the next day. And I think one of the things that is really important is that we are not doing that, that we continue to report on significant things that are happening that aren't necessarily the hottest thing that day. So one way that we've been trying to do that is, I mean, we have a lot of people at the White House, but we try to make sure that we have reporters who are also at the agencies and are actually figuring out what is the EPA doing day to day, what is happening with consumer affairs regulation in this country and things like that. And I get asked a lot, do those stories break through? I mean, if you're trying to do the journalistically correct thing, is anybody actually reading them? And it's a good question because Trump eats up a lot of the oxygen. And you can write a really serious story or do a really serious piece about environmental regulation in this country, and it can get overlooked because he says something, really, really hot that day.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge, I would say.
So Sally runs the AP. Daniel, you're the Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star, and you're it. So first of all, why is a journalist from Canada devoting so much energy to covering the Trump administration? And how do you do it as a one-man band?
So one person is too few people to cover Trump himself, let alone the Trump administration. Canadians, I think, are watching this administration as if they are Americans. And I think that's always pretty much how Canadians observe American politics. We don't see ourselves as naive or ignorant or confused foreigners. I went back home. I just visited my family in Toronto about a year ago, and I went to a coffee shop in my neighborhood in downtown Toronto, and Sarah Sanders' Briefing was playing on the local 24-hour cable station, with like the local weather bar and so on. So people know all the players, they know what's going on, and people are watching this with intense, a local, as if they are American interest. How I do this as a one-person bureau, it's difficult. The biggest challenge is determining, as we all do, as the AP does, but what is worth my time? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that doesn't mean writing the most important story of the day, but trying to find a unique, sometimes even quirky angle or an overlooked story that the AP or the New York Times or Washington Post are not covering. I went to business school in college, and I think of it in terms of adding value. And so I'm being paid to be in Washington. Is it valuable for me to write the same story that 100 outlets are writing about Nikki Haley leaving? Probably not, because we subscribe to the AP. We can run the AP story. So in a case like that today, it would be, can I do some smart analysis about what this means? Today, I don't think I had anything smart to say. In that case, I'd do something else, whether it's a funny story, a serious story, or whatever. But you can't really make plans even when you try to. So one of the ways I've tried to plan to make my life a bit easier when crazy things happen is to write basically advance obituaries for Trump administration figures resigning or getting fired.
Wow.
And so not obituaries, of course, as in them dying, but so I've gotten to use a bunch of these. Steve Bannon, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, and I had one for H.R. McMaster. But because I'm a one-man bureau and because I'm staying up till like very late, I always did, but I'm working often till, from the first tweets, at 7 in the morning, sometimes till 2 in the morning. And so consequently, and especially because my bureau is my home, I have a bed there. I take a lot of little naps to try to cover the Trump administration. So I told my editors when there were rumors that H.R. McMaster was about to be ousted or resign, I have a pre-written story on this, so if it happens, I'll just tell you, go, and we'll post it. And then I took a nap at about noon or something, and then McMaster was ousted while I was sleeping. So my editors are like, in this like 20-minute, half-an-hour period, my editors are like, hello, we thought you had a story. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just, So there's no rest. There's no time to.
Wow.
There's no time to relax. So that's what the administration is like.
Wow, I'm tired just listening to that. But Sally, so even with a bureau of dozens of people in Washington, how do you decide what tweet you're actually going to cover? I mean, with fear of missing out on what's going to be a hot story.
Yeah, I mean, we've had to make, I think not just because of resources, which is one issue, but I think also because of a certain level of responsibility. It was challenging at first. If he would tweet, there was a tweet once that was, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, I'm going to outlaw flag burning in America. Okay, well, the president has a lot of power. The Supreme Court has ruled that burning flags is constitutionally allowed, and so he's not going to be able really easily to change that, okay? And so sometimes you have to take a deep breath and say, this is extraordinary, but what we really need to do is say that this isn't really likely to happen, for example, or something like that, okay? The only thing that I would say about that, and we try to avoid, look, the thing about the AP is that we have a wide set of customers, and we want that to be, we want to create not boring news or neutral news, but we want to create objective, fact-based news. That's what we do, right? And so one of the things that we have tried to avoid a little bit is not to be snarky about the president, not to be, he does a lot of extraordinary things. We let the facts speak for themselves. And that's what we've tried to do. And so we're not in the business of trying to, our journalists are not trying to provoke him when they're asking questions. They're trying to elicit news from him. They're trying to get him to talk about his policies. And that has served us pretty well. We think that that's the best way for us to serve, what is our mission, which is to provide good factual information so that people, you guys, can make decisions about what you want to do. It's not our job to tell you what decisions you should make. It's our job to give you factual information so that you can make good decisions. And so there have been times where we have said, I mean, he's kind of doing this, but that's not really that important. Let's keep that, let's report on it, but let's keep it limited and not kind of blow it into a federal case if it's not going to be a federal case. The only caution I would add on that, though, is that the president is an incredibly important person in the world. When he says things, it does roil the globe. And so you have to keep, even if he says he's going to do something and he can't do it, the words can still have impact. They can have impact on allies, they can have impact on markets, they can have impact on a whole lot of things. And so you can't ever really ignore it, right? And so it's been challenging. But there have been times when we've said, we're staying away from that because we don't, it's not that we're not reporting it, we're just going to report it at the appropriate level, not at the really, amped up level.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you say, words matter. I mean, and
words do matter.
One of the things that Daniel has made a hallmark of his time in Washington is sort of tracking the false claims made by the president. And Daniel will even use the word lie. So Daniel, tell us about Trump checks, how you started that, what the current count is as close as you can, how you managed to keep up, and how accurate your Trump checks are.
Sure. So it started in September 2016. So this was late in the 2016 election. And there was a day in mid-September where I was just so struck by how extraordinarily dishonest one candidate in this race was. And we all know that politicians of all stripes, including his opponent Hillary Clinton, have been dishonest in various ways. But this was just an extraordinary, the sheer quantity of the dishonesty I thought was a story in itself. And my frustration at that time was that I thought reporters were doing a decent job at pointing out the dishonesty on their own Twitter accounts. So if you were an avid Twitter user and you were on Twitter all day, you would know that Trump said 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 false things that day. But if you were to read the story in the next day's paper or online late that day or watch the network newscast or your local newscast, none of that I thought was coming through because, for example, Trump would do a rally speech or a quote-unquote policy speech where he'd make literally 20 false claims, but the ostensible purpose of the speech was to announce, say, a healthcare policy or an economic policy. The way that story was being covered in the next day's paper was Trump announces healthcare policy. And consumers of that story literally would not be told how dishonest this person was. And so I thought, this dishonesty was being treated as a kind of sideshow to the campaign. And I thought, like, this is the show in some ways. This kind of attack on truth, this complete and utter unprecedented disregard for accuracy should be treated as a central story of the campaign rather than something left to the fact checker to talk about in his Saturday column or whatever. And so I decided to try to make a list because I think lists can often serve as a way of accessibly organizing information in a way that trying to cram these fact checks into a conventional article may not. So I thought I would do this for a couple months, and then I thought I'd be free of this responsibility. And so I was at Hillary Clinton's quote-unquote victory party, on election night, and one of my first thoughts when, you know, all these states were falling for Trump was like, oh my God, I have to keep fact-checking this guy. So I took a break for the transition, and then I started his first lie. I think it was in, I forget, I think it was in the inauguration speech, or maybe just after, and he's like, maybe it was at a ball after, he's like, you know, they said it was gonna rain, but it never, you know, God protected me, and it never rained on my speech, and it was raining, you know, as he spoke. So it was literally like the first moment, and then of course, you know, he famously sort of setting the dishonesty tone with the crowd-sized lies. And so the total now, I'm still frantically trying to update from last week because he had 5 campaign rallies, and the more he talks, the more he lies. So it's above 2,900 now. The average at the end of 2017 was 2.9 false claims per day. It's now up to 4.5 per day. And so the pace in 2018 has really accelerated. I could talk about this forever, but basically the most frequent question I was being asked was, is he just talking more, or is the density of his dishonesty, you know, is he lying more per word or just saying more words? And so with the help of a website called FactBase, which does transcripts of all of his comments, we found a way to quantify this. This is like a week-long project. And basically, my conclusion was that he is talking more, but he's also becoming much more dishonest per word as the campaign proceeds, as his term proceeds. So,
and you actually use the word lying and lies, and this is actually an issue in the journalism community because there are some newspaper editors who are famous for saying that, well, you can't be inside someone's head.
Yeah.
So why did you choose to use that wording?
I just think it's you know, if we want to earn trust, we know in media we have a trust problem, and the way to earn trust, I think, is to be honest with people. And for some of the things the president says, there is no honest word, in my view, other than lie. And an example I often cite is, he gave this controversial speech to the Boy Scout Jamboree, you may remember, and he got some criticism for it, and then he said, no, the head of the Boy Scouts called me and said this was the best speech that had ever been given to the Boy Scouts. And then so I contacted the Boy Scouts, and they're like, no one called the president, no one told him that. And so you can go down this rabbit hole of like, well, maybe he's like, he convinces himself that I think, you know, we can safely say that some of these things are lies. I'll add though that I fight with people from the other perspective as well, because I don't call every false claim he makes a lie. I think in many cases it appears that he is either ignorant on policy matters, he is confused for whatever reason. I'm not saying this judgmentally, but I don't think the intent is there to deceive in all cases. And so I often say false claims. I get people yelling at me on Twitter saying, call it a lie, stop normalizing him. I don't think we can use it in all cases, but my argument is that it's the only honest word in some cases.
So, with that, I turn to the executive editor of the AP. Sally, what is your position on using the word lie?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me this question. So we don't have a policy that says that we don't say we don't have a prohibition against the word lie. We subscribe a little bit more to, first of all, I completely, deeply respect Daniel's position and think he's doing terrific work. We do subscribe quite strongly to the idea that it is difficult to figure out intent. I don't think that it is difficult sometimes. The president is a showman. He has a serious problem with speaking accurately. Sometimes he clearly speaks inaccurately on purpose, okay? Sometimes he does it inadvertently. But to me, there's sort of a slightly deeper issue, and it probably just goes to what we're trying to do as a news organization, okay? So there's some academic research that shows that when certain people see the words fact check, they think that it comes from liberal news organizations, right? In other words, it's so ingrained in their head that the world is divided into two camps that when they see certain words, they're not even looking at the facts. They're actually just saying, it's a fact check, so it's from the liberal media, and I'm not going to pay attention to it. So I am a believer in not giving up on any person. I think that the fact is that the most strident ideologue in our society believes in some facts. They believe, somebody says, I'm going to sell you this car for $4,500, And they accept that as factual information and they make a deal based on that, okay? And so my philosophy, my organization's philosophy is that we are not giving up on any human on this planet. We think that if we provide factual information, some of it is going to get through to people. And that is our mission. Our mission is to provide factual information about what's happening in the world and let people make their own decisions. And it's just different. I mean, that's what our mission is. And so we don't have an editorial page. We don't do that. And I think, to me, the biggest thing, and this is not a criticism of anybody else's news organization, but I would rather work for a news organization that people on all spectrums of the political view, the entire political spectrum, look at, rather than talk to an audience that is sort of already convinced and I'm just giving them validation, okay? And I'm not saying that news organizations are doing that, but to me, I've always thought about that, that person out there who's busy in their real life and almost never looks at the news, and then something happens and something is said, and they go look for a non-biased news source because they might be curious, or even they don't do it intentionally, just comes into their world while they're listening to the radio or something. And it it pierces their brain, and they're like, oh, that, there is scientific evidence that global warming happens or something like that. And that, to me, is the nirvana. The nirvana is getting factual information to people who don't really go seeking for it, okay? And that it's in no way, I mean, the world should have a whole group of diverse news organizations, but to me, that has always been the best and noblest goal that we could reach. And that's why I think if we routinely, that's why we don't try to write snarky stuff about the president. That's why we don't try to provoke him at news conferences, because I went to, so a lot of my family is not of the political persuasion that most of the people in this room are, okay? And I went to a party that my brother threw a couple weeks ago, and a woman who is the wife of a retired military officer in suburban Virginia said to me, sometimes when I'm really confused about what's going on and things seem to hype up, I try to look at the AP app and just try to get the bare facts. And there's nothing that could possibly make me happier than that statement, okay? So. But that's just, I mean, I deeply respect what a lot of, you're doing a fabulous thing.
Well, thank you. Well, and you have 170 years of history behind you as well.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that I just think that we want to keep to our standards because that's the long game. And that's what we tell ourselves. There were some people, the day after Trump won, a lot of people in Washington were shocked. I mean, and my news organization was shocked. And that's probably a reflection on us that we weren't out in the community enough and didn't know that that was going to happen. And there were some stories that went around Washington about reporters coming in and saying, I'm not going to cover him. I'm going to protest. I'm not going to cover him. Our deputy bureau chief at the time, whose name is Terry Hunt, a famous longtime White House correspondent, came in and he said, it's not our job to decide who's the president of the United States. It's our job to cover the president of the United States, regardless of who that person is. And for a journalist to say, on principle, I'm not going to cover this guy, you do the good, you do the bad, you're in there for the long game. Your job is to say what's happening in the government and inform people what's happening in the government. And that's what we've tried to keep our focus on.
Yeah. Thank you. So one last question on lies, because I find it so interesting. Daniel, I've read that you said you've talked to people who believe that not only is it okay that the president lies, they like that he lies. Why would anyone like that? What did they tell you?
Yeah, this was really educational for me. So this kind of story has, I think, sort of become a cliche and it's been mocked, but I went out to so-called Trump country in Ohio. And I didn't want to ask people there the standard question that gets stories mocked, which is like, do you still like Trump even though he did this new thing? People say, yes, I still like Trump. But I want to ask them how they are perceiving his honesty and dishonesty as someone who spends so much of, I spend so much of my time fact-checking him. You wonder, not only is my work getting through, but is anything like my work getting through? do these people know that he is lying? If so, do they care? Does it affect their perception of him? And so this was an unscientific sample. It was informal. It was two pro-Trump counties in basically rural Ohio. And one of the most common answers I got was, look, we know that he makes things up, but we like it because it messes with the elites. It gets them running around all crazy, like chickens with their heads cut off. These are the people who, who don't care about me or have made my life miserable. And he's got them all screwed up and they don't know what to do. And so I expected some people to insist that he was honest. I thought some people would say, look, I know he's not always honest, but all politicians are liars. I didn't expect this sentiment that essentially encouraged him to lie because it bothers the people that they don't like. But I think that says something about the current state of our politics. And I think you see reflections of that sentiment in all kinds of debates, from the Kavanaugh debate we just had to any number of others, where people's positions are not so much about the merits, but about what their side can do to the other side, making the other side feel bad or feel confused or feel as insecure as these people themselves feel. So again, I'd emphasize this was an unscientific sample. I don't know how representative it is, but it felt enlightening to me.
Thank you. So let's talk about something else the president says. He loves to use the phrase fake news. And Sally, you've said that we're starting to see dangerous ripples and echoes of the use of the phrase fake news around the globe. What are you seeing and why are you concerned about it?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that is very worrisome, not just to journalists, although it's very worrisome to journalists, but I think to kind of civil society in general, which is that the US, has, whether you agree that it's a good thing to do or didn't think it was a good thing to do, the US for many decades had provided a sort of moral leadership position in the world. Some people viewed that as self-righteous, some people viewed it as a good thing. But it factually is what happened. And I think that there has been a situation where some authoritarian leaders around the world think that it's a little bit more sort of open season because they don't think that the United States is going to stand up quite as much as in the past. So I think you see this in situations, in Myanmar, which is one of the countries that is the most repressive against media in the entire world right now. They're jailing journalists. They're not giving visas. She used the words fake news about the Rohingya crisis, and that just leapt out at me. Like, this is a country that has a terrible problem, and she basically said that the eyewitness reports of atrocities were fake news. And that, I don't know about you, but I find that terrifying. I found that completely terrifying, okay? When we did, and Marina and the previous panel talked a lot about Europe, There's some things happening in Europe. I know we all know that. And so we did a story about some corruption in, I think it was Latvia, I don't remember exactly. And it was about local officials and ties with some corrupt Russian government officials. And we had a photo from about 10 years ago that showed these people kind of yucking it up at a hunting lodge or something like that. And the government essentially said that we had faked the photo, okay? And so that stuff is starting to creep into the rhetoric of authoritarian leaders around the world. And I think that's a really, really dangerous situation. I think the situation that is happening this week in Turkey with the Saudi, he's kind of a dissident and he's kind of a journalist, is really scary, because I think that I don't know if the government of Turkey is strong enough to push back against the Saudis all the way on that thing. There was some reporting today that said that the leader of Turkey is secretly hoping that the United States will be the tough guy on this one. And that kind of thing is different than it used to be. That is, I think, very, very worrisome, both for journalist safety, but also for the much larger universe we live in.
Right, so everyone's probably familiar, but if you're not, so Jamal Khashoggi, who's a Washington Post contributor, went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to get documents for his wedding, and he never came out. And some of the reporting suggests that he was killed inside the embassy. As absolutely horrific. And one of the things, I guess, Sally, that you have to be thinking about as the leader of this global news gathering organization, what does that mean for your people?
Yeah, I mean, we have worries about what the campaign trail in the United States is going to look like. There has been some very, nasty rhetoric and viciousness and sort of threats of violence directed at journalists, sometimes at Trump's rallies, sometimes on the campaign trail. We are worried about that in this next cycle a lot. We have a lot of worries overseas. We think that there is a little bit of a, I don't know what the free reign on journalists a little bit around the world, and that is very scary for us. The interesting thing that we're seeing, which is really nervous, I mean, journalists have been dying in conflicts, and that's a terrible thing, but that's, we try to prevent it as much as possible, but if you're covering a war, the chances that something bad happens to you are high, and that's the reality of the situation. What is scary right now, and I think this was actually CPJ that called this out today, is that it's more like targeted attacks on journalists. It's not people being accidentally, they're covering a war and they get blown up by a mortar. It's that they're actually being targeted for assassination and things like that. That's happened tragically for many years in Latin America, in many places. It seems to be creeping into other parts of the world, and I think that's very scary. Myanmar is, these two Reuters journalists have been essentially thrown in jail for 8 years. The thing that is scary is how incredibly effective that is, okay? Those guys got put in jail, and there's not as much independent reporting coming out of Myanmar. We're trying like mad, I'm here to tell you. But you don't want your people to be thrown in jail either, and so sometimes you have to pull them out of there, because they're going to get jailed if you don't pull them out of there. And so Myanmar did an incredibly effective job of silencing independent reporting in that country by jailing those two people. And you're not going to know what's going to happen with the world's biggest refugee crisis if you don't get some independent journalists there telling you what's going to happen, because that government is not apparently going to accurately report what's going on. So we are very worried. I think it's a very rough time.
So we have a rough time in the rest of the world. We know what's happening here in the US. Daniel, I'm very curious. So in Canada, what's the attitude toward the media? I mean, are they respected? Do you see the same thing happening with how people engage the media with the enemies of the people thing? What's going on?
I've been in the US for 3 years now. 3 years now, I'm based in Washington, so I don't feel like I'm the authority on the current sentiment because it changes fast. I think my sense of it is that, as with many things, we have the same issues as the US does, but in a little bit of a milder form. And so I think we have the same issues with an erosion of trust in media, with a shortage of resources leading to an erosion of local and provincial level coverage, the Canadian equivalent of the loss of state house coverage here in the US. I think so there are important democratic effects of that, but we don't, as of now, although I think the right in Canada, the Conservative Party, has long been more critical of the media than the Liberals and the Social Democratic, New Democratic Party has. You don't see this kind of Trumpian, all-out rhetorical assault, and hopefully we won't. But I don't know.
Okay, so I'll ask you both an easy question before we go to the audience questions. What's going to happen in the midterms?
What's going to happen in the midterms? Whoa.
Answer that any way you want.
Well, I think that the real effect of the recent fight over the Supreme Court nominee was basically to sort of, heat up both sides, but not necessarily change that much about the overall balance, because the Republicans got very energized by this debate, and I think that the Democrats also did. I think the most important thing that's happening, so Trump's base is extremely supportive of him. There's been no erosion as far as we can tell. There does seem to be some erosion in support of what we commonly call, I don't know, independent suburban women in certain locations, okay? And that's probably going to benefit the Democrats in the House races because the Democrats are probably going to, I don't know if there's going to be a blue wave, no idea, but it does seem like the Democrats have a pretty solid, at least potential chance to win control of the House because there's some erosion of Trump support among independent women in particular, I would say. I think that happened before Kavanaugh. It certainly is likely to be intensified by Kavanaugh. The Senate, though, is, the Republicans, the Democrats always had a tough uphill climb on the Senate, and I don't personally see any change in that. I can't predict what's going to happen, but it certainly does not look, a betting person would not think that the Democrats are, they have a tough road to regain the Senate, I would say. And it doesn't seem that there's any change in that. So that's, I'm just telling you what we've been writing in analysis on The Wire. I'm not like making any, this is what our reporters think is happening.
So Daniel, just a slightly easier question for you. So what are you preparing to cover? Because you're a one-man band, you try to find the unique things, the things that will rise above some of the other coverage. What are you watching in the next few weeks?
So it's a very limited amount of time for a one-person bureau to cover the midterms. I've been occupied by NAFTA, or not NAFTA, we can't call it that anymore, by the USMCA. So those negotiations had been my focus for a number of months. Now they're wrapped up, so I have less than a month to basically cover the midterms. So I'm interested in a couple of things. One is as Sally was talking about, the efforts in suburban, more educated, more upscale districts, like we see in California, by Democrats to flip long-held Republican districts that were won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so after I finish at Stanford today and tomorrow, I'm going to go to the LA area and go to some districts like Congressman Knight's district, for example. That race against Katie Hill is very interesting. What's intriguing to me is that the House races are existing almost in a separate universe in some ways from the Senate races. So you have this universe of House races in which those kinds of female voters are very important. And then we have these contested Senate races that are, overwhelmingly in very conservative, very pro-Trump states that react very differently to things like the Kavanaugh battle. And so I'm interested in the interplay between those two. Will we have totally separate outcomes?
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Great, thank you. So now we will have a lightning round and try to get in some of the audience questions. So, okay, what would happen if the media did not cover Trump on a minute-by-minute basis?
Great question. Would he tone it down? Would he play less the media? These are the kinds of things we debate. I think that there is some evidence that he does respond to attention. So one of the reasons that we try to do, what I talked about, which is to not make a federal case out of something that isn't that important, is kind of to try to keep that sober sort of attitude toward that. I don't think that that's ever going to happen. It's hard for me to do that because I completely have sympathy with the question. On the other hand, it's not just Americans who are in this vortex. I spent a week in Japan and Asia in February. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to get to ask all these questions to a person. Every newspaper editor and every, media person that I talked to in Japan, just grilled me about Donald Trump for 2 hours solid over dinner. And so, they are, and it's not an irrelevant thing for them because he has the ability to impact their world, okay? And so it's not just that Americans are obsessed with this. This is an incredibly important person in an incredibly important position. And ignoring him is not really it's not an option, basically.
So next question, can you please explain the ethical principles or guidelines that journalists and media organizations use when we receive information from a source who may have violated laws to obtain or release the information? Daniel, any?
Can I defer to you because she's the head
Okay.
of an
Yeah,
organization?
sure.
And this question is about hacking or just about sources?
It's about sources who might have obtained information in questionable ways.
Question.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that journalists, I mean, our standards say that we should always pay attention to the source of the information and the motivations of the person who gives you information, especially if it's secret, especially if it's illegally obtained. I mean, generally in the United States, reporters cannot ask someone to go break the law for them, but if they get information that is illegally obtained, they have a First Amendment right to publish it if there are reasons to publish it, okay? So we were always used to putting ourselves through these ethical questions. If an anonymous source, if someone clearly has a grudge, the information could be tainted. Then again, maybe the information isn't tainted. Maybe the information is inherent in documents, and the person has a grudge, but the documented material is still important and still of public interest. So those are the kinds of questions that you go through. Does the person have a grudge? Does the person have a vested interest? Is the information solid despite that? Has the person tainted the information in some ways? Do they have it in a real, factual way, okay? So we were used to doing that. Then all of a sudden, information started coming out through hacks, okay? And we struggled for a little while. There's no question. Everybody struggled during the 2016. Now, we didn't understand all the ramifications. We didn't know that it was deliberate plants and things like that. But, it's the same issue, but in a different context, where people are deliberately releasing hacked information to make other people look bad, okay? And so what we have learned, and journalists learn, they make mistakes, and as things change, they have to take their ethics and their standards, and they have to figure out, a new situation. Now I need to think about hacking, and I didn't ever think about that because it never used to exist, okay? And we learned over time that we could be manipulated by people who hack, just like we could be manipulated by sources. So I think we've gotten, we're learning and we're getting better at that, but there was a rocky period, I would say. And it's not just my organizations, it's everybody where we struggled with this issue.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel, you actually spent a lot of time looking at these. Who really writes Trump's tweets? Are they vetted by White House staff?
We still don't I haven't seen any authoritative reporting on this. We know some of them. If there is a hashtag or a photo montage or anything that involves things other than words, it's likely someone other than the president. Dan Scavino is the social media director. We know that he writes some of them. I have read, although I haven't confirmed with my own reporting, that he likes to workshop some of his tweets. So he'll propose these 140 or 280 character messages to people around him and hear them out and then tweet it. But I think many of them, and I think it is clear that many of them are indeed authentically Donald Trump.
Okay. Great.
Especially the ones at 5:30 in the morning.
Yeah, there are times, and there's there's the Fox hour. There's distinct periods of his tweeting.
Well, and for a while there was some analysis being made based on whether it looked like the tweet came from an Android phone or an iPhone, or I don't know what type of currency that actually had.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, okay. So a question that sort of goes to the ethics of journalism itself, I think, to help people understand what we do. Do you think it's fair that the media controls what's deemed newsworthy based on what sometimes are personal hunches, which in essence, that itself can constitute a toxic closed source black box model?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what I would say is that the way that our world is going, there is more opportunity for people to break through what you might think of as, the people who determine the news or something like that. Marina was the greatest example of that, right? There are organizations, other nonprofit news organizations, some of them very small in your communities or in other little communities, bloggers, other people who can bring issues forward that, maybe news organizations are ignoring, and put that forward as another sort of conversation. So I think that if you think there was a monopoly of news organizations decided this was important and this wasn't important, some of that is being broken. There's a fascinating story today about some of the information that's coming out about the guys, Britain has accused the Russians of killing the spy, poisoning the spy. And some of the really solid, what we think of as kind of journalistic information that has come out is a private sort of investigative group, a couple guys who had done a lot of good work around the Syrian war and things like that, and they have been trying to figure out who the Russians behind this were. So, I mean, is that a news organization? Is it an advocacy? I don't know what exactly it is, but it's a really interesting phenomenon that is a good source of objective information. And so there's a lot more sources of information in our world. The thing that I fear, and this is, I think, where the question is getting is, after the last election, everyone kind of was wringing their hands and saying the Washington bubble was too inside baseball and it became too self-reflexive and it didn't actually know what was going on in the country. And we're going to reform that. So if you look at Washington news right now, it's become more inside baseball. It's focused totally on Trump. It hasn't gone out and talked to a person in Ohio in a real long time, okay? And I do fear that, the vast majority of journalists in this country are centralized in Washington. It's a very important story. But I would love, it would be the best thing in the world if there were more journalists who were out in local communities and more journalists doing investigations on things that didn't have anything to do with Donald Trump. And, I think that's the danger, is that the heavy focus on inside baseball politics in our country, which is incredibly important because our politics are crazy. We don't want that to be the only story that gets reported in this country, and that's what I worry about.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. Let's thank Sally and Daniel for joining us this evening.
Thank you.